All right, this lecture will cover the short booklet, What is Ethics? A collection of introductions to moral philosophy. Now, the discipline of philosophy is split into four main branches: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and logic. Now, this class is Introduction to Ethics, so this is where we're going to start. The study of ethics, or moral philosophy, is also split into four main branches. We have normative ethics, metaethics, applied ethics, and value theory. Let's consider normative ethics, right? This is the area of ethics that considers what kinds of things are good and bad, and how we should go about deciding what kind of actions are right and wrong. And this is the main tradition of ethical thinking, extending back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, essentially asking, how ought we live if we are to live well? What sort of things ought we do? What sort of things should we not do? And then what are the theories, right, the principles that articulate, right, those standards for us? So the concept of normative, right, in normative ethics has to do with behavior that conforms to a standard or a norm, right? In that sense, normative ethics formulates the standards of right behavior. And normative ethical theories formulate overarching moral principles which instruct us how we ought to act. So an example of a normative ethical principle would be something like, it's wrong to violate another person's basic human rights. So here's a definition of normative ethics that you'll need to know. Normative ethics is that branch of ethics that, one, seeks to identify the morally relevant characteristics that make right actions right and wrong actions wrong. And on that basis, two, formulates overarching moral principles or norms that clarify how we ought to act in the world. And there are many contenders in the field of normative ethics. Divine command theory tells us that actions are right because God commands them. Right? Easy enough. You've got God, who is the moral lawgiver. Oh, what action's right, what action's wrong? Just appeal to God. That is to say, appeal to your particular religious tradition. Natural law theory, which doesn't necessarily assume that God is the ultimate source of morality, argues instead that correct moral action is a matter of acting in a way that respects human nature. So we look towards human nature, what's kind of fixed and natural about human beings, in order to infer what sort of things are right and what sort of things are wrong. What actions must we do and what actions must we never do, right? We appeal to human nature and natural law theory. And then there's ethical egoism, right? Ethical egoism argues that right actions are those actions whose consequences advance the interest of the individual acting. And no matter how badly off those actions leave others. Whereas the normative theory of utilitarianism proposes that the right action is the action whose consequences increases happiness for the greatest number of people, even if it leaves the individual, right, who performed the action worse off. Then there's Kantianism, named after the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, right? Kantianism argues that the consequences of an action are completely irrelevant to morality. For Kant, morally right actions are actions that are done in accordance with moral duties. We have moral duties, and they are placed upon us by the use of reason. So for Kantianism, we have an absolute obligation to perform our moral duties regardless of whether or not the consequences of performing that duty increases or decreases happiness in the world. And because all human beings are rational creatures, we discover these absolute moral duties through the use of reason, right? So our duties and our obligations come from reason and rationality, not from God, as in divine command theory. So those are a few of the theories within normative ethics, right? The main tradition of ethical philosophy. Next, we'll briefly consider metaethics. And this is a combination of the concepts ethics and metaphysics. Metaphysics has to do with the study of reality and existence. So metaethics is concerned with the reality of ethics, how ethics and morality and moral obligations, if they exist, how they come to exist. So, for instance, while normative ethics attempts to identify what actions are good or bad and why, metaethics investigates what morality itself is and how morality emerges and comes to exist. So, metaethics will study such questions as, are moral duties and prohibitions universally binding across cultures, or is morality relative to culture, right? Varying dramatically from one culture to the next, right? Is morality real and objective, or is morality subjective, which is to say, is the idea of moral laws and moral obligations just a sort of convenient fiction that we tell ourselves? And what are moral duties? For instance, reasonable people come to recognize that we ought not bully others, right? To use an obvious example, because wanton cruelty is wrong. This is what most rational people will just kind of come to believe, right? And more, it feels like we recognize that wanton cruelty is wrong rather than merely just believe it. So the question then is, if there are such moral duties, right, such as a prohibition not to be cruel, how do we explain how this comes to exist, right? Do they come from a moral lawgiver like God? Or is it the case that our moral duties are placed on us by the use of reason, right, like Kant argues? So you see that normative ethics, like divine command theory and Kantianism, has an underlying metaethical theory, which justifies its particular normative ethical orientation, right? Or perhaps an awareness of our moral duties comes from emotional faculties like empathy. And perhaps capacities such as empathy and altruism are sort of imprinted on our genetic makeup as a result of evolutionary psychology, right? Having a capacity like empathy and altruism was a clear advantage for a species like human beings, right? That needed to cooperate and care for others in order to survive, right? So perhaps our evolutionary psychology is what's responsible for the origin of moral obligations. So those are a few metaethical perspectives. Next, we'll look at value theory, right? This is a third branch of ethics that is that part of ethics that attempts to determine what things are valuable in themselves, right? What values and goods make life truly worth living, right? In other words, what are the necessary ingredients of the good life? Is happiness, for instance, the ultimate and highest good in life? And what is happiness, right? Is happiness just maximum pleasure, like the philosopher Jeremy Bentham argues? Or is happiness more like what the ancient philosopher Aristotle argues, right? Happiness is an ongoing way of living in the world, a way of life that expresses something about our human nature and allows us to flourish and live in accordance with virtue. In addition to happiness, what are the other precious things in life that are intrinsically valuable, right? i.e. valuable in themselves, like autonomy, right? Loving relationships and friendships, personal growth, pleasure, recreation, moral virtue, religious and spiritual experience, solidarity, community, art, having meaningful work and labor in life, and political freedom. And is there a hierarchy among different intrinsically valuable goods? If so, how are the different values and goods ranked, right? And then there's also the corresponding social and political question. What values and goods ought to be given the most priority when we're organizing our society? In other words, what are the most important values around which the good society will revolve, right? What values does the good and just society promote above all others? All right, so the last main branch of ethics that we'll discuss is applied ethics. This is the branch of ethics that deals with concrete, controversial ethical problems, dilemmas, and conundrums. So examples of popular moral problems addressed in applied ethics are the question of abortion, for instance. Is killing a fetus morally wrong or morally permissible? And even if abortion is morally wrong, should government have the power to force a woman to carry a fetus for 9 months, depriving her of decision-making power over her own organs? The affluent people have a moral duty to save children by donating to charity. So right now, across the world, at all times, we're dealing with a just massive child die-off in places in the so-called third world, right? Where children die from easily preventable diseases. It's just that they don't have the resources, right, in those countries to prevent the massive child die-off. So do people in wealthier countries who have disposable income, do they have an obligation to donate to charity? Should the U.S. government pay reparations for historic injustices that our country committed against African American and Native American peoples? It's a big applied ethical question, right? Also, do citizens have a right to engage in civil disobedience, to break the law and disobey the police? Is it okay to punch the KKK or Nazi protesters in the streets? It's the question of what type of actions are permitted in the context of social and political protest or social and political rebellion. What is the meaning and role of violence in protest? Ought recreational drug use be legal, right? Even if we think that there's something morally wrong about using certain recreational drugs, we can look at societies, countries, for instance, like Portugal, which legalized recreational drug use and treated it as a public health crisis and not just a criminal offense. And in treating it as a public health crisis, successfully brought down the numbers of overdoses, right, in their particular country. But that was by legalizing drug use in the first place, giving people a safe area to both use drugs, but then also to provide them with necessary health care and other resources to help them overcome their addictions. Under what conditions is physician-assisted suicide morally permissible, right? Do we have a right to kill ourselves, but to do so in a way that is not going to be painful and that's guaranteed to succeed, right? Which is to say, people who are suffering from terminal illnesses and have only 6 months or a year left to live, right? Do they have the right to seek assistance from medical professionals to help in their lives in a dignified and painless way? What forms of censorship are ethical? Is it wrong to purchase or consume meat from factory farms under which the condition of the animals who live in those factory farms is absolutely kind of reprehensible, oftentimes what would amount to torture for the animals? Should churches be taxed or remain tax exempt? And does this apply to all churches of any religion? Is it morally wrong to strip away voting rights from prisoners and other convicted felons? What sort of tactics are immoral in wartime, especially pertinent right now as an applied ethical question? Should the state be permitted to punish its citizens by killing them, right? This is the question of capital punishment. Is genetic modification of human beings morally wrong? Should hospitals deny life-saving blood transfusions to minors if the parents, let's say, are Jehovah's Witnesses and they object, believing it's against God's will for a person to receive a blood transfusion? Should vaccines be mandatory by law? Do privately owned businesses and restaurants have the right to refuse to serve customers who enter without shoes or shirts? What about who enter without wearing masks during global pandemics? Is it okay to share or pirate digital content? Should prostitution be legal? Do corporations have a moral status? How far do property rights extend? For instance, do you have the right to frack on your own land, even if it's likely to compromise the public health of the entire community? Right, so those are a bunch of applied ethical topics and questions. We will look at a few of those later in the semester in a section of class on applied ethics. But those are the four main traditions of ethics: normative ethics, metaethics, applied ethics, and value theory. And that concludes this video lecture. Thank you.